He never expected the day to break him. He never expected one small moment inside a noisy school cafeteria to flip everything he thought he understood about the world, about his daughter, and about himself. But as he pushed open those cafeteria doors, carrying a lunch bag he packed with his own hands at dawn, he had no idea he was seconds away from a truth sharp enough to stop his breath cold. It started like an ordinary morning, the kind that blends into every other weekday. The sun rose slow, the air still heavy with the quiet of neighborhoods that hadn't fully woken up yet. Marcus had been up since 5, moving through the house like a man with a purpose. He wasn't the kind who liked being late, not for work, not for life, and especially not for anything involving his daughter. Ever since he became a single father, every day felt like a chance to prove to her that he was enough. Not perfect, but enough. He packed her lunch with the same care he gave everything that touched her life. Peanut butter and jelly cut into perfect squares because she liked the edges sharp, a handful of grapes rinsed twice because she once said school grapes tasted weird, a juice box, and a small note he scribbled every morning with little messages reminding her she mattered. He knew kids her age tossed notes away or hid them, but he hoped maybe one or two made her smile before she threw them out. He drove her to school through the usual morning chaos, the crowded streets, the honking cars, the people rushing like their lives were held together by thin pieces of tape. His daughter sat quiet in the backseat, watching out the window, holding her backpack like she was protecting something inside it. She wasn't shy, just thoughtful in a way kids her age rarely were. When she stepped out of the car, she gave him the same small wave she did every morning, not big, not loud, just soft and sure, as if she trusted he'd always be right there watching her walk away. But by lunchtime, everything changed. Marcus was at work, sorting through a pile of reports that never seemed to shrink, when his phone buzzed. It wasn't the school calling, no emergency, no warning. It was simply a message from his daughter, something she had never done before during school hours. 5 words. Very short. Almost nothing at all. But those 5 words carried something heavy, something that made his stomach twist. She said she forgot her lunch. He stared at the message for a moment too long, wondering how she could have forgotten something he placed right next to her water bottle, practically in her hands. But he didn't waste time. He grabbed the lunch bag from the passenger seat of his car and drove to the school, convincing himself it was nothing. Kids forget things all the time. Maybe she was distracted. Maybe she was rushed. Maybe it didn't mean anything. He arrived at the school office, signed in as a visitor, and headed down the long hallway toward the cafeteria. But as he approached those double doors and heard the chaotic mix of laughter, shouts, and lunch trays clattering, something inside him tightened. A strange instinct whispered that whatever he was about to see wasn't simple forgetfulness. He pushed open the door. It felt like stepping into another world, noisy, bright, restless. Dozens of kids packed the tables, talking with mouths full, waving juice boxes around like trophies. Teachers moved between the tables trying to keep order. Marcus scanned the room, looking for the familiar head of curls that was always easy to spot. But when he found her, his shoulders stopped halfway through a breath. His daughter was sitting alone. At a table meant for 8 kids, she sat on the very edge, her back straight, her backpack in her lap instead of on the floor, her eyes locked on nothing. The other kids didn't even glance at her. They crowded together on the opposite end of the table, their laughter bouncing off the walls like it belonged to a world she wasn't part of. Some kids pretended not to notice her. Others looked at her with the kind of glance that wasn't cruel on the surface but held something quiet and sharp, something she had felt many times but never spoken about. Marcus stood frozen, the lunch bag slowly slipping from his hand until he tightened his grip. He had convinced himself for months that kids were kids, that maybe she exaggerated, that maybe she was just shy. But this was evidence he couldn't pretend away. Her tray was empty. She wasn't eating. She wasn't talking. She wasn't doing anything but shrinking, trying to take up less space, trying to disappear inside a room full of children who didn't even see her as part of their world. His chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt since the day he became a father, the day he promised himself he would never let her feel alone in a world that could be so cruel. But here she was, alone in the one place she should have felt safe. He moved toward her table slowly, like each step carried a weight he had never trained for. But the closer he got, the more details he noticed, Small things that cut deeper than anything big enough to scream about. Her juice box was missing. Kids around her had juice boxes, several extras, some tossed aside like trash. But hers wasn't anywhere on the table. She had grapes on the table earlier, he could tell by the faint stains near her backpack, but they were gone now, too. A few kids at the far end of the table were laughing over something on their trays, grapes. Not theirs. The same type he packed. His stomach turned. Her sandwich, the one he cut so carefully, was half unwrapped but untouched. She didn't even look at it. It was like she didn't want to open something that wasn't hers anymore. And that's when he understood. She didn't forget her lunch. She hid her lunch. She hid it because someone took pieces of it before. Someone teased her for what she ate. Someone made her feel different for something as simple as food. And she didn't want to get in trouble. She didn't want to complain. She didn't want to make noise in a place where she was already made to feel like she didn't belong. Marcus felt something inside him break. A quiet break, the kind that doesn't make a sound but tears everything apart from the inside out. His daughter lifted her head, and when she spotted him standing there, she froze. Her eyes widened in a way that wasn't joy and wasn't fear, it was the look of someone trying to swallow something painful before anyone else could notice. She wasn't embarrassed of him. She was embarrassed of being seen like this. She shouldn't have been. She had done nothing wrong. He sat down beside her, but she didn't move. Her hands tightened around the straps of her backpack as if she were afraid he'd take it away. For a long moment, he just looked at her, really looked at her, the slight slump of her shoulders, the way she kept her eyes down to avoid the stares she assumed might come, the way she tried to make herself small in a world that should have celebrated how bright she was. He set the lunch bag on the table. But he didn't open it. Instead, he placed his hand gently on her back, feeling the tiny shiver that ran through her as she tried to stay calm. Kids around them noticed him, but only because an adult sitting at the table was unusual, not because they saw anything wrong with what had been happening. That hurt even more. He watched as a boy at the other end of the table looked at him, frowned, then looked away as if none of this mattered. As if the empty space around his daughter wasn't something worth caring about. As if loneliness was invisible. He hated the feeling rising inside him, the mix of anger and sadness and guilt. Guilt for not knowing sooner. Guilt for believing her silence meant she was okay. Guilt for trusting the world to be kinder than it was. He swallowed hard, steadying himself. He opened her lunch and placed everything in front of her, one item at a time, not rushing, not pushing. She watched with shaky breaths like she wasn't sure if she should smile or cry. She whispered something he couldn't hear, her lips moving like she was apologizing for needing him. But he wasn't angry. He wasn't disappointed. He was heartbroken. She tried to eat, but her hands were trembling. She wasn't hungry. She was overwhelmed. And he knew right then that he couldn't leave. Not today. Not after this. Not after the truth hit him so hard he could barely breathe. So he stayed. In that noisy lunchroom, at that lonely table, in the middle of children who didn't understand the weight of what they'd done. And he didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply stayed beside his daughter, letting her feel something she hadn't felt in that cafeteria for a long time, protection. Something shifted then. A girl from another table glanced over, hesitated, then quietly moved her chair closer. Not beside his daughter, she wasn't that brave, but closer than before. Enough to create a small crack in the wall of distance. A few other kids looked too, their faces unsure, their expressions softening when they realized this wasn't funny, this wasn't a game, this wasn't something to shrug off. And maybe they didn't fully understand. Maybe they didn't know the depth of the hurt they caused. But for the first time, they noticed her. That was enough for today. When the bell rang and kids rushed out, his daughter stood slowly, clutching her backpack, her eyes still wet. She reached for his hand, not because she was scared, but because she finally allowed herself to need someone. He walked her to her classroom, and before she went inside, she turned back and gave him the tiniest, softest smile he had seen in months. It wasn't bright. It wasn't bold. But it was real. And in that moment, it felt like the world gave him a small piece of hope back. That night, after she went to sleep, Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the lunchbox he'd wash and refill the next day. He thought about how easy it was for kids to hurt each other without meaning to. How easy it was for parents to miss the signs. How easy it was for silence to hide pain. He promised himself that would never happen again. He would show up more. Ask better questions. Watch more closely. Not because she was weak, but because the world sometimes made gentle kids carry burdens far too heavy for their small shoulders. The next morning, he walked her to school instead of driving. She held his hand without a second thought. And when they reached the building, a few kids from her class waved at her, not big waves, just little ones. But little was enough. For the first time in a long time, she waved back without looking at the floor. Marcus felt something settle in his chest. Something warm, something steady, something hopeful. He realized the world wasn't perfect. Kids weren't perfect. Parents weren't perfect. But moments like yesterday didn't have to break them. They could build them. The cafeteria wasn't kinder overnight, but it was no longer a place she walked into alone. And Marcus knew that sometimes, that alone changed everything. His daughter didn't become the most popular kid. She didn't suddenly make dozens of friends. But she gained something even more important, the strength to take up space in a world that once pushed her to the edges. And Marcus found his own lesson too. Sometimes greatness as a parent isn't in the big things, the loud things, the impressive things. Sometimes it's in showing up at the exact moment your child stops expecting anyone to. Sometimes it's in opening a cafeteria door and seeing the truth. And sometimes, that truth changes both of you forever.